Chapter 5 Don Quixote, in which is continued the account of our knight's mishap. Seeing that he couldn't stir, he resolved to have recourse to his usual remedy, which was to think of some incident from one of his books. His madness made him remember that of the Marquess of Mantua and Baldwin, whom Carloto left wounded on the mountainside, a story familiar to children, not unknown to youths, celebrated and even believed by old men. Yet for all of that, no more authentic than the miracles of Muhammad. Now this story, so he thought, exactly fitted his present circumstances. So with great display of affliction, he began to roll about on the ground, and to repeat in a faint voice the words that the wounded knight in the wood was supposed to have said. "Where art thou, lady of my heart, that for my woe thou dost not grieve? Alas, thou knowest not my distress, or thou art false and pitiless." In this manner he repeated the ballad until he came to those verses that say, "O noble Marquess of Mantua, my uncle and liege lord, by chance there happened to pass by, at that very moment, a peasant of his own village, a neighbor, who was returning from bringing a load of wheat to the mill. And he, seeing a man lying stretched out on the ground, came over and asked him who he was, and what was the cause of his sorrowful lamentation. Don Quixote, firmly believing that the man was the Marquess of Mantua, his uncle, would not answer, but continued reciting his ballad, which told of his misfortunes and the loves of the emperor's son with his wife, just as the book relates it. The peasant was amazed to hear those extravagant words. Then taking off his visor, which had been broken to pieces in the drubbing, he wiped the dust off his face. No sooner had he done so than he recognized him and said, "Master Quixana," for that must have been how people called him when he had his wits and had not been transformed from a staid gentleman into a knight-errant. "Who left you in such a state?" But he kept on reciting his ballad, and made no answer to what he was asked. The good man then, as best he could, took off his breast and backplate to see if he was wounded, but he saw no blood or scar upon him. He managed to lift him up from the ground, and with the greatest difficulty hoisted him onto his ass, thinking that beast an easier mount. Then he gathered together all his arms, not omitting even the splinters of the lance, tied them into a bundle, and laid them upon Rocinante's back. Then taking the horse by the bridle and the ass by the halter, he set off toward his village, meditating all the while on the foolish words that Don Quixote kept saying. And Don Quixote, on his part, was no less pensive, for he was so beaten and bruised that he could hardly hold himself onto the ass, and from time to time he uttered such melancholy sighs that seemed to pierce the skies, that the peasant felt again moved to ask him what was the cause of his sorrow. But it must have been the devil himself who supplied him with stories so similar to his circumstances, for at that instant, forgetting Baldwin, he remembered the Moor Abindarés, whom the governor of Antequera, Rodrigo de Narvaez, took prisoner to his castle. So when the peasant asked him again how he was, he answered word for word as the captive Abindarés answered Rodrigo de Narvaez, just as he had read in Montemayor's Diana, where the story is told. And he applied it so artfully to his own case that the peasant wished he were in hell, rather than to have to listen to such a hodgepodge of foolishness. This convinced him that his neighbor was mad, so he made haste to reach the village, and thereby escape being further plagued by Don Quixote's long discourse. The latter ended by saying, I would have you know, Master Rodrigo de Narvaez, that the beauteous Jarifa I have mentioned is now the fair Dulcinea of El Toboso, for whom I have done, still do, and shall do the most famous deeds of chivalry that ever have been, are, or ever shall be seen in the world. To this the peasant answered, Take heed, sir, that I am neither Don Rodrigo de Narvaez, nor the Marquez of Mantua, but Pedro Alonso, your neighbor. And you are neither Baldwin nor Abindarez, but the honorable gentleman, Master Quijana. I know who I am, answered Don Quixote, and I know that I can be not only those I have mentioned, but also the 12 peers of France, and even the 9 worthies, for my exploits will surpass all that I have ever jointly or separately achieved. With this, in sundry topics of conversation, they reached the village at sunset. But the peasant waited until it was dark, so that no one would see the belabored knight so sorrowfully mounted. When he thought the time had come, he entered the village and went to Don Quixote's house, which he found in an uproar. The curate and the village barber, great friends of Don Quixote, happened to be there, and the housekeeper was addressing them in a loud voice. What do you think, Master Licentiate Pedro Perez? That was the curate's name. Of my master's misfortune. For the past 6 days, neither he, nor his horse, nor his buckler, nor his lance, nor his armor has appeared. Woe is me! I am now beginning to understand, and I am as sure of it as I am of death, that those accursed books of chivalry that he continually reads have turned his brain topsy-turvy. Now that I think of it, I remember hearing him say to himself many a time that he wished to become a knight-errant and go through the world in search of adventures. The devil and Barabbas take such books, for they have ruined the finest mind in all La Mancha. The niece said the same, and a little more. You must know, Master Nichols, this was the name of the barber, that it was a frequent occurrence for my uncle to read those soulless books of misadventures for days and nights on end. At the end of that time he would cast the book from his hands, clutch his sword, and begin to slash the walls. Then, when he was grown very weary, he would say that he had killed 4 giants as big as towers, and that the sweat that dripped off him after his great exertions, he would say, was blood from the wounds he had received in battle. Then he would drink a great jug full of water and become calm and peaceable, saying that the water was a most precious liquor, that his friend, the great enchanter, Esquife, had given him. I, however, blame myself for all, for not having warned you of my uncle's extravagant behavior. You might have cured him before things reached such a state, and you would have burned all those excommunicated books. He has many, mind you, for they all deserved to be burned by heretics. I agree with that, said the curate, and I hold that tomorrow must not pass without a public inquiry being made into them. They should be condemned to the fire to prevent them from tempting those who read them to do what my poor master must have done. All this Don Quixote and the peasant heard. The latter finally understood the infirmity of his neighbor and began to shout, Open your doors, all of you, to Sir Baldwin and to Marquez of Mantua, who is grievously wounded, and to the Moor Abindarez, who is led captive by the valiant Rodrigo de Narvaez, governor of Antequera. Hearing these cries, they all rushed out and straightway recognized their friend. They ran to embrace him, but he had not yet dismounted from the ass, for he was not able to do so. He said, Stand back, all of you. I have been sorely wounded through the fault of my horse. Carry me to my bed, and if possible, call the wise Urganda to examine and cure my wounds." A thousand curses," said the housekeeper then. "My heart told me clearly on which foot my master limped. Come on upstairs, sir. We'll know how to look after you here without that Urganda woman. Curses, aye, 100 curses on those books of chivalry that have driven you to this." They carried him to his bed and searched his body for wounds, but could find none. He said he was all bruised after a great fall he had with his horse, Rocinante, when he was fighting 10 giants, the fiercest and most overweening in the world. "Aha," said the curate, "so there are giants too in the dance. By the sign of the cross, I swear I'll burn the lot of them before tomorrow night." They questioned Don Quixote 1,000 times, but he would give no answer. He only asked them to give him food and allow him to sleep, for rest was what he needed most. This was done, and the curate cross-examined the peasant about the conditions in which he had found Don Quixote. The man told him all, including the extravagant words he had said when he found him and on the way home. This made the curate still more eager to carry out a project that on the following day he actually did, namely, to call his friend Master Nicholas the barber, with whom he came to Don Quixote's house.